These are the lecture notes for Chapter 35 on the respiratory system. We've got 3 sections. It's kind of a short chapter. Section 1 is on the gas exchange surfaces, like, for example, in other animals. But again, we're going to focus more on human. But in humans, the gas exchange surface would be the air sacs of the lungs, called the alveoli, and their connection with the capillaries. So there are capillaries that connect with that line the alveoli, and where they connect, where they contact, that's the gas exchange surface. So we'll talk more about that. In section 2, we will cover breathing, inhaling and exhaling, and then also external and internal respiration, and the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the blood. And then we will cover human respiratory diseases and problems, and then the human respiratory system as it relates to human respiratory diseases. So first of all, for the definition of respiration, it is the sequence of events that results in gas exchange between the body's cells and the environment. So gas exchange meaning oxygen needs to enter the body cells for cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide needs to be removed and removed back to the environment. So in terrestrial vertebrates, in other words, vertebrates that live on land, respiration includes 3 processes. Ventilation, which is breathing, involves inspiration and expiration, or you might say inhaling and exhaling. In external respiration, that is the gas exchange that occurs between the air and the blood, and this happens in the lungs. It happens in the structures called the alveoli, between the alveoli and the blood capillaries. So that's external respiration. Then internal respiration is the blood capillaries and the tissue cells. So it's the gas exchange between the blood and the tissue fluid, or even more specifically, the cytoplasm within the cells. Within our individual cells, because all of our cells have to carry out cellular respiration, and they get the oxygen for cellular respiration from our bloodstream. So our cells have to exchange gases with our blood. And this is showing you external respiration occurs in the lungs. That is when oxygen enters our blood from the lungs. And internal respiration is when oxygen leaves our blood and enters our tissue cells. For external respiration to be effective, the gas exchange regions must be moist, thin, and large in relation to body size. In other words, a large surface area. This is one of your quiz questions, which could end up being an exam question. So the gas exchange surfaces must be moist, thin, and have a large surface area. Aquatic animals expend more energy to breathe than do terrestrial animals, and that is because it is more energy efficient to extract oxygen from air than it is to extract it from the water. Okay, I'm going to skip over those. The terrestrial vertebrates have evolved lungs. Even the amphibians, whose lungs are reduced, they're not as large and they're not as efficient, but they do have them. They just supplement their breathing through their skin, which it says right here, most amphibians respire to some extent through the skin. And then the air is a rich source of oxygen compared to water. So that's the reason that the reason for the evolution of lungs is and in terrestrial vertebrates is because it's a whole lot easier to breathe with lungs and extracting the oxygen from air. This shows you a combination of different respiratory organs. I haven't highlighted this, but I'm just going to show you. The gills of fish have to extract oxygen from the water. They use a mechanism called countercurrent exchange, where the water flows past the blood vessels in one direction and the blood flows in the opposite direction. And that enables they're able to remove oxygen from the water a lot more efficiently with that countercurrent flow. And grasshoppers basically have these open holes in their exoskeleton called spiracles, and those spiracles attach to trachea. So all of these little places here have trachea. They don't just have one trachea. And then the trachea end in tracheoles and these little air sacs. So they're kind of like primitive lungs, I guess you would say. And then, of course, you've got your little dog who has got lungs similar to humans. Okay, and I mentioned to you that gills utilize countercurrent exchange in order to transfer oxygen from the environment, which is the water, to their blood. Countercurrent flow means that the two liquids flow in opposite directions. That means the water flows past the gills in one direction and blood flows in the opposite direction of that. And that results in 8 to 90, it can be up to 90% of the oxygen from the water is extracted. Okay, so it's more efficient. All right, moving on to the lungs of humans, because we're going to concentrate on the respiratory system of humans. There's air moving through the upper respiratory system, which is filtered by hairs and cilia. It's warmed and humidified. And then the air that reaches the lungs is, by the time it reaches the lungs, it's at body temperature and saturated with water. So the pharynx is the throat, and air passes from the pharynx to the glottis. The glottis is the opening to the trachea. The larynx and the trachea are permanently held open by cartilage rings. They're C-shaped rings, and this facilitates the movement of air. When food is swallowed, the larynx or voice box rises. The glottis is closed by the epiglottis, and that prevents food from going into the trachea. The backward movement of the soft palate when we swallow prevents food from entering into our nasal cavity. So food enters the esophagus behind the larynx, and air goes into the trachea. Then the trachea divides into, the first two branches are called primary bronchi. There's a left primary bronchus that serves the left lung, and a right primary bronchus that serves the right lung. And then the bronchi continue to branch until they branch into smaller passages called bronchioles. And they just differ in the size. Bronchi are larger, bronchioles are smaller, and bronchioles don't have some of the cartilage that you find in the bronchi. Alveoli are the air sacs at the end of the terminal bronchioles. The last set of bronchioles branch into alveoli, and these are air sacs, and they're microscopic, so there are millions of these alveoli in our lungs. The internal gas exchange, which this is very misleading because this is not talking about internal respiration. The definition of internal respiration is gas exchange between the blood and the tissue cells. This is just talking about the gas exchange between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. It's just saying that it occurs internally. So don't get confused. That's still, between the alveoli and the blood, still refers to external respiration. That's what it refers to, external respiration. And you can see the pathway that air would come in would be through the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, past the larynx and into the trachea, past the epiglottis and into the larynx and the larynx and the trachea, and then into the bronchi. And the bronchi continue to branch until you end up with the very last bronchioles that end in these clusters of alveoli. One air sac is an alveolus, but they are organized into clusters, kind of like a cluster of grapes. and see how each alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries. So that's where the gas exchange occurs. All right, for breathing and transport of gases, this is section 2. Inhaling is called inspiration in mammals, and inhaling or inspiration uses negative pressure. It's defined as the act of moving air into the lungs. What happens is the rib cage moves up and out and the diaphragm contracts, but be careful because when the diaphragm is relaxed, it is actually pushed up, like a bell. But when it contracts, it moves down and flattens. What this does, it causes the thoracic cavity to expand. And so the volume in the thoracic cavity, or the lung volume, increases. And the relationship between volume and pressure is called Boyle's law. When volume increases, pressure decreases. That's just physics, That's just a law of physics. So when the lung volume increases due to the movements of the rib cage and the diaphragm, then the pressure decreases in the thoracic cavity. So that's what is meant by negative pressure, okay? Pressure decreasing in the thoracic cavity makes it less than the pressure outside, the atmospheric pressure. So the atmospheric pressure, since it's higher, it forces or pushes air into the lungs. And that's what causes inhalation or inspiration, is lung volume increasing, and therefore the pressure inside the lungs decreases. And then you can basically reverse that for expiration or exhaling in mammals. That's the act of moving air out of the lungs, and it's due not to a negative pressure, but the creation of a positive pressure in the lungs. So what we want is for the pressure in the lungs to be greater than the pressure outside. In this case, the rib cage moves down because the muscles relax. The diaphragm relaxes and moves up. Remember, it moves up and it's like a bell shape now. So by the rib cage kind of shrinking or relaxing and not expanding but contracting, and the diaphragm relaxing, that volume inside of the lungs is going to be decreased, much decreased. And this is a passive process. When you're just exhaling, when you're not using any force to exhale, just like if you're just sitting here breathing, not exercising or anything, you don't have any contraction of any muscles. It's just the muscles of inspiration will relax. And that's what allows the rib cage to relax and the diaphragm to relax. So what happens is, since this volume decreases in the lungs, that is going to increase the pressure in the chest cavity or thoracic cavity. And by doing that, that forces or pushes air out of the lungs. So it's this relationship between volume and pressure. Inhalation increases the volume in the chest cavity, and that causes the pressure in the chest cavity to decrease. And so therefore pressure outside is greater, and that moves air in. And in exhaling, you have the decreasing of the volume of the thoracic cavity, which causes the pressure in the thoracic cavity to increase, and that's going to push air out. So that's exhaling. And the muscles that are involved in inspiration are going to be the diaphragm. See how it's different? It pushes down, it moves down and causes there to be more space or volume in the thoracic cavity. Over here is what it looks like when it's relaxed. It's moved up further into the chest. And here's a better picture. This is a contracted diaphragm. It's almost flattened out. And this is one that is relaxed. And the muscles that are used for inhaling are the external intercostal muscles. External intercostal muscles. And for exhaling, basically the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relax. Now, if we forcefully exhale, really hard and forceful, we do use the internal intercostal muscles. They contract when we exhale. All right. Ventilation is breathing, inhaling and exhaling. all terrestrial vertebrates, with the exception of birds. Birds have a very special, I think I showed you this in the chapter 30 on the vertebrates, but they have a special breathing mechanism that's different from the rest of the terrestrial vertebrates. But all terrestrial vertebrates besides birds utilize a tidal ventilation mechanism for breathing. Tidal meaning the tide comes in and goes out. So in the case of breathing, air moves in and out by the same route, just like the tide comes in and out by the same route. But birds use a one-way ventilation mechanism. We're going to review that even though we went over it in chapter 30. Incoming air is carried past the lungs by a trachea, which takes it to posterior air sacs first, and then the air passes through the lungs to the anterior air sacs. That is when it is exhaled or expelled. We call it expelled. Fresh air never mixes with used air in bird lungs, and that increases the efficiency of the gas exchange. It increases the efficiency because birds really need to have efficient breathing because they fly.